My name is Laurie King. I am teaching professor of anthropology at Georgetown University and also a member of the board of directors of the Arab Center here in Washington. Before introducing our panel, I would like to encourage all of you, as the previous panel moderators have done, to participate in this session using the question cards that should be right in front of you on all of the tables. If you are joining us online, the Q&A function or feature on Zoom, or by emailing any questions you may have to events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. And I'm really delighted and honored to be on this panel with people, some of whom I've known for a while, some of whom I'm just meeting, but all of whom I have really admired for many years. I will introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting, and the more detailed bios of each of the speakers can be found in your program. First, we will be hearing from Kenneth Roth. He is the Charles and Marie Robertson Visiting Professor at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs and the former Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Next, we will hear from Matthew Duss, the Executive Vice President of the Center for International Policy, and then Sarah Lee Whitson, who is the Executive Director of Dawn, and last but not least, Lana Baydas is Program Director at the Center for Human Rights at the American Bar Association. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking time to join us today in person or online.
Okay, thanks very much, Laura. I'm very happy to be here, and it's great to see such a wonderful turnout. And I understand there are many, many more online. What I want to address this morning is the opportunity presented by what I see as a rhetorical shift as Biden retires from the scene and Kamala Harris asserts herself and tries to become our next president. It's a shift that I have some mixed feelings about, but it has some opportunities for us, as I say. And the shift is this. Biden has tended to frame his foreign policy as pursuing the global contest between democracy and autocracy. Now, I say I have mixed feelings because I actually think there's a lot to that frame. I do think that there's a global contest between democracy and autocracy. But it became a bit embarrassing because Biden is rightfully focused on the threats posed by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. But he has approached these challenges not in a principled way, but by building alliances that include many, many autocrats. Mm-hmm. And so, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Modi's India when it comes to China, these are not paragons of democracy. And so the hypocrisy factor became, kind of undeniable. And this, didn't play terribly well in many parts of the world where they say, well, okay, you want us to give up loans from China or arms deliveries from Russia, but you're being completely unprincipled. Like, why? Why do we take sides in this if it's just about, different superpowers vying for dominance? So Kamala Harris comes in and, she doesn't say this explicitly, but in essence, she says, I'm going to reframe. And I'm going to talk about the rules-based order. Now, this is not, novel language. I mean, we've heard about this for a while. But she seems to have dropped democracy versus autocracy in favor of the rules-based order. And, it makes some sense for her because she's a former prosecutor. She understands the importance of rules. But when she talks about the rules-based order, she tends to have in mind the easy things. The rules like you don't invade your neighbor. There's such a thing as sovereignty. Or rules governing international commerce or investment. What she doesn't like to talk about is that part of those rules are international human rights and humanitarian law. And this, presents the same kind of hypocrisy problems because, again, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE when it's, underwriting yet again a genocide in Darfur, Ethiopia and Tigray. I mean, you can go on and on. Governments that are not only undemocratic but are also flouting basic human rights and humanitarian law norms. And of course, I don't need to tell anybody here, the most glaring example of the rules being violated is what Israel is doing in Gaza, and the West Bank, and now, from what we can tell, Lebanon. And I won't recite where things go wrong, but you can go through war crime after war crime, whether it's the indiscriminate bombardment that just levels neighborhoods in Gaza, the attacks that have a disproportionate harm on civilians, dropping 2,000-pound bombs just to go after Hamas tunnel, or bombing, school after school after school, or going after Hamas fighters in the middle of a displaced persons camp, shutting down the hospitals when there's an acute need for them. I can go on endlessly. And of course, the International Court of Justice has, found that Palestinian rights under the Genocide Convention are probably in jeopardy, and therefore has issued a series of provisional measure orders. And just a quick aside, I won't dwell on this, but ironically, the best defense Israel has to the charge of genocide, and this is a defense only because of the incredibly conservative jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, is to say that the only possible inference from our conduct in Gaza is not genocide because there's an alternative inference, which is the war crime of mass expulsion. And under the ridiculous jurisprudence of the ICJ, that's a defense right now. We have to push them to change their jurisprudence, but that's where we are. And of course, the other rule that now we have to deal with is that the ICJ has come out and said the occupation is not the classic kind of temporary occupation that is going to be over with quickly, but that the prolonged occupation is a de facto forced annexation. And although they didn't use the term, in essence they said this is an act of aggression. It is no different from what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So these are among the international rules that Kamala Harris has to pay attention to if she wants to be promoting the rules-based order. There are also domestic rules. We often talk about the Leahy law. And I think most of you are familiar. It prohibits sending U.S. arms to a unit of a military that is abusive. I am not a big fan of the Leahy law because it cheapens what U.S. law actually is. There's a separate law, 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which says there can be no security assistance, meaning arms sales or military aid, to any force, not just unit, but force, that systematically violates international human rights or humanitarian law, which describes Israel. So you don't have to play these games of saying, oh, what about this little unit, and is it reformed, or was a soldier in that unit taken into account? You look at the big picture, which is what you should do. We've tended to forget about 502B and focus on Leahy. Leahy is supposed to be easier to implement. It's more incremental, but it's a mistake. And I think we should go back to 502B and apply it in the case of Israel and Gaza. But of course, that's a rule that Kamala Harris doesn't want to focus on. And beyond that, there are the rules that the International Criminal Court is trying to uphold. And as you all know, the U.S. government's reaction to the prosecutor's request for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, along with 3 senior Hamas officials, was to say the court doesn't have jurisdiction. Palestine's not enough of a state to be able to join the ICC and confer jurisdiction, even though the UN General Assembly has found Palestine to be a non-member observer state, even though 146 of the 193 member states of the UN have fully recognized Palestine. Even though the only reason why there is not a full-fledged Palestinian state is the US veto in the Security Council, even though the International Court of Justice has said that governments are precluded now from giving legal recognition to the occupation, which is the only reason, of course, that Palestine is not a state. So, these are all rules that are kind of inconvenient if the aim is to promote the rules-based order. Now, the panel just before us I found very interesting. And, I think we have to recognize that, first of all, Trump would be a disaster. And I think we just have to say that up front. Trump's, priority when in power was, the Abraham Accords, basically getting governments to normalize relations with Israel while throwing the Palestinians under the bus. The idea that today we have to look to Mohammed bin Salman to resurrect the idea of a Palestinian state as a prelude to normalization of relations with Israel shows, how utterly indifferent the U.S. government has become. MBS, this is not a guy who could care less about the Palestinians. He's just reflecting Saudi public opinion. Trump essentially greenlights anything that Netanyahu wants to do. And so while, I am frustrated by Kamala Harris's unwillingness to sort of even address some of the contradictions that I mentioned between the rules-based order that she's trumpeting and the rules that are being flouted, she's not going to do this before the election. It's just, if you look at her entire campaign, it's about not getting precise. And the idea that she's going to get precise on as difficult an issue as Israel-Palestine, while she's not getting precise on anything else, it's just not going to happen. And so I think what we have to do is to, on the one hand, try to get her elected, and I'll come to that in a moment. And then, as Jim Zogby was saying in the last panel, then try to push her as members of a coalition to do the right thing after she's elected. But, I'm aware of, other members of the panel who are talking about, well, she hasn't done anything to deserve my vote. And, and I recognize that, and I don't believe in blaming voters. I actually think the uncommitted effort was very important during the primary because it was a statement. It was sending a message. It didn't actually have consequences. But in the general election, obviously voting for Trump, I think mostly is not going to happen among people who care about this issue. But voting for Jill Stein or abstaining is effectively a vote for Trump, or at least half a vote for Trump. And I don't think we can be oblivious to the consequences, to say, well, I'm making a statement. I feel that, we shouldn't be doing that. And what I worry about a little bit is that, the uncommitted kind of message that we rightfully were sending at the primary stage, I think to kind of continue that message now and to continue to say they're not hearing me, and so therefore why should I vote for her? To do that now is to encourage people to be oblivious to the consequence of their votes when those consequences are enormous. And so, I think back to the effect of Ralph Nader in, the Bush v. Gore election. And, many people were voting for Ralph Nader to make a statement. They weren't happy with the choice. But, the consequence to get Bush as opposed to Gore, we saw within a year what a huge difference it made. Gore's reaction to 9/11 would have been nothing like Bush's. And I fear that we're facing a similar moment now. And so, much as I wish Kamala Harris would address some of the points that I've made this morning, she's not going to do it before the election. And I think we have to accept that and figure out, who is the most likely emerging from that election to be the least bit receptive to these kinds of concerns. And it's not Donald Trump. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Matthew Duss. Matthew?
Hi. Thanks. Good morning. Glad to be here. Great privilege to be on this panel with people I admire enormously. I'll say a few things, keep my remarks relatively short, but I want to agree with pretty much all of what Ken just said, but I will start with what we can expect from Vice President Harris. I tend to agree we're not going to hear more. I think my own view is that she probably could go a bit further, but I don't think she will. As Ken said, I think she is trying to just say the bare minimum. without getting into too many specifics, but on the bright side, I tend to be someone who tries to find the bright side whenever possible. I want to agree with the great work of the uncommitted movement. Many in this room have been part of the effort to get more from the vice president, get commitments and hear more from her about how she's going to hopefully lift up Palestinian rights. But I do just want to say, as that point of optimism, if you go back to her convention speech, which was relatively short, which didn't contain a lot of foreign policy, didn't contain really much about human rights. She did what she said about Palestine and the rights of the Palestinian people. While it was not new or innovative, it was new to hear it from the candidate from the stage at the convention. So if we're thinking about things, as she was looking at it, these are boxes I need to check as the Democratic Party's candidate for president. Palestinian rights and self-determination is now a box that the Palestinian nominee needs to check. And I know that that's not sufficient for many people. I understand that, but I do think it's worth noting, just as a reflection of the work that so many in this room and in this city and in this country have been doing for such a long time to lift up this issue. Now, going back, I don't know what more I need to say about Trump. I think Ken captured it pretty well. Doesn't care about human rights. Occasionally, he'll have a Secretary of State, as Mike Pompeo did, who will occasionally use human rights as a cudgel against our adversaries. And unfortunately, that's not uncommon in Washington. That's also something we've seen, unfortunately, from this administration. I wish it were not the case, but it's true. When we hear about the rules-based order, what does that actually mean in practice? And I often think of the quote from the Peruvian General Benavides, "For my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law." That is pretty much how the United States thinks about human rights far too often. I think the chasm between the rhetoric of Joe Biden as a candidate and the policy as a president has been enormous. I think we saw some steps taken early on in the administration. I think we're good. There are things I'm going to acknowledge that they have done that are important, and the diminishing of the number of drone strikes. I think it is worth noting. They have come down severely. I'm very glad that we're assassinating fewer people with flying robots. I wish that wasn't something we had to celebrate, but I do think we should acknowledge it. But in general, I think human rights has become completely subsumed by strategic competition. And this is where I want to talk about the Middle East. This is, Ken talked about the normalization with Saudi Arabia, the kind of tripartite U.S., Israel, Saudi pact. And my view is that this is basically a U.S.-Saudi pact, a defense pact with a kind of candy coating around it of peace with Israel, which is how we're trying to sell it to Democrats. That's how you get enough Democrats to vote, because MBS apparently wants a Senate-ratified treaty so that a future administration can't abrogate it. Though, of course, as Donald Trump showed, a future administration could abrogate pretty much what it wants. But I guess for MBS's own confidence, he wants this to be a Senate-fied, ratified treaty with a U.S. security guarantee. I've always been skeptical that will happen. I don't think it will happen now, and that's a good thing. I think this is a horrible idea, but what is driving it is strategic competition with China, not only but mainly. Obviously, Iran, the concern with Iran plays a part, but strategic competition with China is the lens through which this administration, and in many ways this entire city, has started to think about foreign policy. And if everything is colored by how do we compete with China, how do we kind of box China out of this region, you're just going to collect friends and allies for their own sake, regardless of the nature of those relationships. And I think that's what we see with Saudi Arabia. Do we need to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia? Sure, relationships are good. We do not need to underwrite that relationship with a promise of sending young American women and men to fight and die for this regime. I think that's again a very bad idea, but it makes sense. If you remember the old anti-drug ad, this is your brain. This is your brain on drugs, where you break the egg in the frying pan. This is your brain on strategic competition, right? Is let's sign a security guarantee with Saudi Arabia. And again, this is not a new phenomenon either. We saw this through the Cold War, where the imperatives of the U.S.-Soviet competition led us to kind of cut deals and build relationships with horrible regimes, with horrible actors all over the world, and the consequences for human rights all around the world were quite bad. Some places worse than others. But the logic is always, making deals where these repressive, corrupt leaders, they essentially deliver our security. So we're essentially exporting insecurity onto these populations in the name of this larger strategic goal. Now, that's not to dismiss the idea that the world is complicated. I'm not saying it's simple, but I do think there's a bit more space to have more kind of nuanced relationships with some of these leaders without giving them, for example, a state dinner for the Indian Prime Minister, which is the moment when it really became undeniable that this strategic competition was going to color this administration's entire foreign policy. Again, India's a rising economy. It's growing in influence. It has a huge population. We need to have a relationship with India, regardless of its leader. But throwing a state dinner and an address to a joint meeting of Congress is, in my view, certainly not required to have the relationship that we do need to have with India. So the costs for human rights here, if we're going to just see everything through this lens of strategic competition, will continue to be bad. And that's the question I have about a potential Harris administration. I think some of the people around here, I know many of these people know, they're smart, they're pragmatic. But again, we don't have a lot to go on is she going to double down on this? Or is she going to kind of step back and reassess, both the costs and benefits of seeing foreign policy in this way? And, part of what I think is going to help determine that is building the constituency for human rights, for actually upholding international law in this country and in Congress. And again, to kind of wrap on yet another note of optimism, I do think, as tough as things are, and I don't want to kind of be glib about it, because what we've seen over the past year has been absolutely catastrophic. But I do see a Congress where we have more champions on these issues than perhaps any time in my lifetime. They've been, as I said, that is part of what made Palestine a box that Vice President Harris needed to check in her speech. But I think continuing to build that constituency, continuing to use the tools of the law, one of which Ken mentioned, the 502B provision, there are others, to really press a future administration on these issues, which is to say, this is not some kind of new idea. This is upholding the law. The problem is we simply have not been doing that. Why? Because it's politically hard. We saw a report just earlier this week from ProPublica about reports from within the State Department about Israel blocking humanitarian aid, blocking food aid, other forms of aid into Gaza as a policy. That is a violation of international law. That's a violation of our laws. And yet, the State Department, Secretary Blinken, overruled those reports and issued the report, as we know they did, which was like, yeah, they were kind of doing that at one point, but they're kind of not. They're kind of doing better. And they explained it. He explained it. I saw an interview where he did yesterday. He was like, well, we had different reports saying different things, and it's actually pretty typical that we made this decision. And no, I mean, first of all, I'm sorry, bullshit, all right? Every international aid NGO said what was happening. The U.S. aid agencies themselves said what's happening. This administration knew what was happening. What is actually pretty typical is an administration deciding that they were going to take the politically easy route, which was to kind of fudge it. That is what is typical about it, and that is what we need to build a bigger and more powerful constituency to change. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Next, we will hear from Sarah Leigh Whitson.
Thanks, and so good to see so many friends here today. Our Arab Center, thank you for this great gathering, because it's not just an opportunity to hear so many interesting viewpoints, but also to have in-person, real-life connections, which become increasingly precious in the post-COVID era. I want to focus my remarks quite specifically today on how I see a Trump versus Harris presidency playing out in the Middle East. And I don't share and I don't see any grounds for optimism, I'm afraid. This is, in fact, the topic of an article I have coming out tomorrow in the American Prospect, but you're going to get an advanced preview here today. I think despite the admittedly widely divergent outcomes on domestic matters, particularly on civil rights and civil liberties, which will impact all of us as members of civil society, some of the loudest activists in civil society, I think there's far less uncertainty about the foreign policy outcomes under either a Harris or Trump presidency in the Middle East. Like the Biden administration before it, a Harris administration may be softer around the edges with its rhetoric, but with no policies to back them. And so my prediction is that the outcome, sadly, will mostly be more of the same. There are, I think, two main reasons for this. First of all, the global worldviews of Harris and Trump are actually pretty similar, grounded in an article of faith that has undergirded all of America's post-World War II foreign policy, and that is maintaining U.S. hegemony and supremacy. You know, the flavors may change from decade to decade: competition with China, competition with Japan, competition with Russia, but really it's all about U.S. primacy and maintaining that. And there is full agreement on this, as Kamala Harris recently declared, that the U.S. must have the most lethal military in the world. She went out of her way to declare this twice, not once. So while Trump may have a more openly mercantile or even mercenary approach to U.S. forces abroad, demanding that the beneficiaries may pay more for protection, he is a unilateralist, not an isolationist. So at bottom, I don't see either candidate revisiting U.S. primacy, and as Matt pointed out, this is what will guide and poison U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East under either administration. Second, both Harris and Trump are subject to the overwhelming incentive structure that rewards administrations that continue to spend more on defense and sell more weapons abroad than any other country in the world. We have the double whammy of the military-industrial complex and foreign government purses, which means that all of the upside comes from more spending and selling of weapons. There is no countervailing economic pressure and very little political pressure. Foreign policy remains largely the province of an elite clique of decision-makers, and none but sadly the tiniest segment of the electorate, as we heard earlier, prioritizes foreign policy issues in their voting. In the Middle East, this incentive structure is at its most powerful, combining not only the influence of the defense industry and the seemingly bottomless wealth of Gulf states, but two additional factors: the influence and control of the pro-Israel lobby, which was, as pointed out, has the resources to eliminate candidates who threaten its positions, and Arab control over oil that determines the prices Americans pay for fuel. Within these confines, I anticipate some marginal but not very consequential differences. Let's start with Israel. The Democratic Party has become increasingly divided over the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israel in the face of the war in Gaza. And we know that a strong majority of Democratic voters now opposes military aid to Israel and supports Palestinian rights. Candidate Harris no doubt feels the pressure to promise some recalibration of Biden's policies, particularly as swing state uncommitted Democratic voters could toss the election to Trump. But she has largely confined this to expressions of sympathy for Palestinian suffering. She has, however, reiterated Biden's pleas for a ceasefire, but refused to support conditioning aid to Israel. She will feel the sway of her pro-Israel donors much more than her voters once she's elected, and so it's unlikely that her policies will consequentially shift away from Israel. Her own advisors have said there will be no daylight between her and the Biden administration when it comes to Israel, and so there's no reason to believe, for example, that she's going to walk back Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital or Israel's annexation of the Golan, just as Biden has failed to do. Whether Harris will prioritize securing more Abraham Accords for Israel, as Biden has done in lockstep with Trump, this is not a Republican plan or proposal or agenda. It has been the Biden administration's #1 foreign policy agenda in the Middle East. But Kamala's own support for this, Vice President Harris's support for this, remains to be seen, but neither she nor her national security advisor, Phil Gordon, have said anything to suggest moving away from this. The Biden team has already agreed to Saudi Arabia's two outstanding demands, the bilateral security agreement and construction of a civilian nuclear plant. But without tying them to Israeli normalization, it's doubtful the Senate will approve these terms. And it's conceivable that Trump will actually take a tougher line with Netanyahu, forcing him to accept a ceasefire, if not any pathway to Palestinian statehood, to secure Saudi normalization, something he very much wants to deliver. But it's just as conceivable that he pushes for a separate, standalone deal with Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia has proposed. The most important issue where Harris and Trump are likely to have different takes, in my opinion, is a move by Israel to annex most or all of the West Bank. Now, Ambassador David Friedman, who served as Trump's ambassador to Israel, has openly endorsed Israeli apartheid and proposed annexation of the West Bank, minus voting or political rights for Palestinians, and he has said he's consulting with Trump on the matter. Trump delivered everything else on Friedman's wish list when he was president. He also made clear that he sees Israel and Palestine not as a struggle to end apartheid and occupation or to establish Palestinian self-determination, but as a real estate dispute between Jews and Arabs. So it stands to reason that he would ultimately support Israeli annexation of the West Bank, as well as Israeli demands that the other Arabs take the Palestinian population and give them some of their own land. A Harris administration, in I think classic Democratic fashion, would wring its hands and rump up rhetorical condemnation were Israel to move on annexation, but it's very doubtful that it would take stronger measures such as suspending arms transfers or supporting sanctions. If a genocide in Gaza hasn't been enough to persuade candidate Harris to demand even a suspension of weapons, it's doubtful that annexation would persuade a President Harris to do so. Sadly, the legal grounds, namely the international law prohibition on acquiring territory by force to prevent such an annexation, are now greatly eroded, thanks in no small part to the United States itself. The Trump administration led the way in breaking the taboo, recognizing not only Israel's Golan annexation, but also Morocco's annexation of Western Sahara. The U.S. Has completely ignored the ICJ ruling that Israel's occupation is illegal and that it must remove its forces and citizens from Palestine, so it's hard to see how more illegal acts would tip the Harris administration into abiding by international law. Harris should have sufficient support from the anti-Netanyahu but pro-Israel camp to take some tough measures to try to dissuade Israel from annexation. But whether they'll be sufficient to persuade Israel remains to be seen. I think Netanyahu may calculate that he can afford to be in the Harris doghouse until annexation becomes old news and the forced displacement of Palestinians alongside the accompanying humanitarian catastrophe becomes the new news. It's much easier to remedy humanitarian harms with aid, as Harris would likely do, than it is to fight and punish violations of a severely eroded law. I think Harris and Trump will also have different strategies to deal with the ICC's ongoing prosecution of war crimes in Gaza, which has indicted both Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, but has delayed issuing the arrest warrants against them. I think we are certain, and because Trump has said that he will move again to sanction the court's prosecutor and staff and may escalate further, even pushing other states to withdraw from the Rome Statute. Harris, like Biden, is unlikely to take such actions, but also, like Biden, will exert maximal pressure on the court behind the scenes. Trump would definitely, and Harris most likely, refuse to arrest Netanyahu should he arrive in the United States after the ICC issues an arrest warrant. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Biden's ambassador to the UN, 2 weeks ago very clearly said that the Biden administration would not arrest Netanyahu even if there were a warrant. Next is the pivot, the great pivot. Neither the Biden nor the Trump administration achieved any of their oft-stated goals to withdraw from the Middle East and pivot to Asia. But Trump may be the stronger candidate here in his ability to avoid broader entanglement in a regional Middle East war, both because of his general posture against expanded U.S. military interventions and his willingness to act openly as the boss of the Middle East. While Biden notably ended the war in Afghanistan and has finally secured an agreement to remove U.S. forces from Iraq, he has entered into a new war footing in Yemen without congressional authorization and massively expanded the deployment of American military forces to the region. He's also worked to reassure the UAE and Saudi Arabia using U.S. forces to deploy Patriot missiles on their behalf. And of course, it is the Biden team who's put the finishing touches on the security agreement for the Saudi regime. Where both administrations will converge is continued massive arms sales to the region. Biden initially promised to halt weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, but he caved to the built-in incentive system. While Trump has made clear his enthusiasm of maximal weapons for maximal profit, the Harris team, like the Biden team before it, will speak more softly but deliver the same results. Biden promised no more blank checks for Sisi. He indeed has delivered several billion-dollar blank checks to Egypt, removing any of the remaining pretend conditions on human rights reforms, going further than any administration before him. Such weapons sales and support for abusive regimes in the region are built in as a cost worth paying in the Harris-Trump shared worldview that prioritizes U.S. military domination of the Middle East. What remains a toss-up is policy on Iran. Harris's lead National Security Advisor, Phil Gordon, played a leading role in supporting the JCPOA nuclear deal with Iran under Obama. Harris supported the JCPOA and would likely want to pursue a renewed nuclear deal with Iran. If there is a significant change in U.S. foreign policy toward Iran, it's unlikely, however, to happen under Harris, because any rapprochement with Iran, including a nuclear deal, would face intense scrutiny, extreme anti-Iran sentiment among both Republicans and pro-Israel Democrats, which shackle her from moving forward, particularly if the conflict between Israel and Iran continues to flare up. For now, at least, candidate Harris is treating any endorsement of a less pugilistic policy on Iran as an opening for a political attack. This month, she criticized Trump for suggesting that he would consider lifting sanctions on Iran. He reasoned that sanctions hurt the U.S. economy, encouraging de-dollarization. So assuming Trump remains guided by anti-Iran extremists, he will also continue to oppose renewing the JCPOA and likely support further surprise attacks on Iranian facilities and targets and even a low-level state of war. But if he frees himself from extremists like John Bolton, he may well be interested in reaching an agreement with Iran, if only to prove he's the president who can deliver the best deal for the U.S. The reason Iran policy will remain a toss-up, however, is that it may not be up to either Trump or Harris to choose a course of action if Israel's efforts to escalate war with Iran succeed. If Israel continues its attacks on Iran and tensions in the region spiral, there won't be any room for a new nuclear deal, and the only question will be whether or not the U.S. steps in to fully back Israel in a war with Iran. Changing course to normalizing America's very abnormal policies in the Middle East, Republican and Democrat, it isn't impossible. We need legislative reforms that can and should tackle the malign influence and infiltration of the defense industry, foreign states, and lobbyists acting on behalf of open states, just as open debate can reform outdated and harmful ideological commitments. If there's any good news here, it's that public opinion is clearly desirous of a new approach. And the only challenge that remains is forcing our own government to comply with the will of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And next we have Lana Baydas.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the Arab Center colleagues for their invitation. I'm so honored to share the panel with people I admire, and I learn human rights from them. But before I begin, I would like to note that I speak today in my personal capacity. My intervention reflects my expert opinion and should not be construed as representing ABA policy. So I've been asked to focus my remarks on the place of human rights in the US foreign policy in the Middle East. And my co-panelists made it very easy for me. And I will go into starting looking at the approach, the US, how the US approached its policy in the Middle East that's been shaped over the decades by security concerns. As stated, it focuses on three primary objectives: countering terrorism, countering nuclear proliferation, and unconditionally supporting strategic allies militarily and economically, with the ultimate goal to achieve peace and security in the region. But that's, again, as stated. While both Republican and Democratic administrations have professed a commitment to human rights promotion, the priority given to human rights has fluctuated, as we heard from my co-panelists, according to geopolitical and strategic interest shifts. The US has employed various tools to address the human rights issues in the region, but these efforts has often been inconsistent and subordinate to strategic interest. We mentioned Egypt, which is a classic example. It has been receiving economic and military aid from the United States since 1947, totaling more than $79 billion. Egypt has always been perceived as a strategic ally of the United States in the region and continue to be seen as a peace broker and a balancing power in the region. The allocation of foreign aid has been influenced by both the domestic and international political, economic, and security environment. Little consideration has been paid to Egypt's human rights records. This has emboldened successive governments in Egypt while withering away human rights protection. In the name of countering terrorism, and a key issue that determined US aid to Egypt, the Egyptian authority have carried out massive arrests of human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, a political opponent, dissident for exercising their rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. The 2023 State Department country report on human rights practices indicated a large number of enforced disappearance cases as systematic in Egypt. However, as Sarah Lee mentioned, a few weeks ago, the Biden administration announced that it is moving to provide $1.3 billion in military aid to Egypt, despite the reported grave human rights situation in the country. And this all despite the empirical research that has demonstrated that human rights abuses are one of the main pull factors for radicalization. According to Human Rights First, torture and inhumane treatment in Egypt prisons, and I quote here, is fueling ISIS growth as the group recruits supporter in Egypt prison at an accelerating rate. And this is the point that this approach is failing one of the key objectives of the US foreign policy. Another example is Saudi Arabia, and we heard US-Saudi relations are based on mutual interest, countering terrorism, and containing the expansion of Iranian influence in the region. From 2015 to 2019, Saudi Arabia was the world's largest importer of arms, mostly from the United States. According to 2022 US Government Accountability Office report, the US Department of Defense administered military support worth at least $54.6 billion to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, primarily for defense articles and defense services. The arms sale to these two countries continue despite the finding of the UN and civil society organization that Saudi-led coalition airstrike on Yemen have been indiscriminate and amount to war crimes. This was also despite legal opinions that the ongoing sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the face of the misuse of such equipments in Yemen violated Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, Section 3 of the Arms Export Control Act, which prohibit the provision of weapons to country engaged in a consistent pattern of gross human rights violations. On the domestic front, Saudi Arabia crack down on critical voices, dissent, abusing counterterrorism measures. CSO's report documented how the Saudi Specialized Criminal Court, which is an anti-terror court, and counterterrorism and counter-terror financing laws were used to target human rights defenders, several of whom face life imprisonment and long-term travel bans. The Biden administration at the beginning vowed to reset the relationship with Saudi Arabia and put the human rights issue at the center of the US relationship with it. Yet, with the shifts and the turmoil in the region, the administration announced recently it would resume offensive weapons sale to Saudi Arabia after a 3 years hiatus. Now, if we turn again to Israel, another strategic ally in the region, Israel uses counterterrorism measures to crack down on Israeli and Palestinian civil society actors. In 2021, it designated 6 prominent Palestinian organizations as terrorist organizations based on a secret evidence revealed their involvement in terrorist acts. We don't know what's the evidence been provided. It continued to be a secret evidence. In the occupied West Bank, the Israeli authority arrested and put arbitrarily detained lawyers, human rights defenders, journalists, since before October 7 and accelerated after October 7. We talked a lot throughout the day in terms of the impact of the war in Palestine and Israel and the death toll. But the Israeli forces have killed over 44,000 and injured over 90,000 Palestinians, and the majority of whom have been women and children. We also talked about the International Court of Justice ruling in terms of that it is plausible these acts amount to genocide, while UN officials allege variety of war crimes and clear violation of IHL, International Humanitarian Law. President Biden himself has acknowledged that Israel campaign has been over the top and indiscriminate. CSOs, and as we heard from Matt, the USAID memo have documented numerous instances in which the Israeli government has restricted the delivery of a humanitarian aid, violating Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. The FFA prohibit the United States from providing security assistance or arms sale to any country where the president is made aware that its government prohibits, I quote, prohibits or otherwise restricts directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance. Also, pursuant to President Biden National Security Memorandum 20, which required the Secretary of State to obtain credible and reliable written assurances from foreign governments receiving defense article and services, Secretary Blinken reported in May it's reasonable to assess that Israeli security forces have used U.S. weapons to violate international humanitarian law or best practices for reducing harms to civilians. The report, however, avoids making any specific legal determination and concludes that Israel's assurances regarding humanitarian aid and international law compliance are credible and reliable, meaning that the United States can continue to supply its partner with weapons under an SM-20. This selective emphasis on human rights, coupled with a militarized foreign policy and selective enforcement or adherence to domestic and international law, not only undermines the U.S. credibility, but also emboldens allies to commit human rights abuses with impunity. The above shows that the current approach does not achieve the U.S. foreign policy priorities. It destabilizes the region, fuels the region's conflict, and kills all prospect for peace and security. I will return to the conference theme, what's the future of U.S. foreign policy in the region amid the ongoing wars? And again, this is my expert opinion and do not represent ABA policy. I would say, as Sarah Lee mentioned, there is a future for changing course, but that should be done through foregoing unconditional support to government that violate human rights and international humanitarian law and US laws and policy, and increase congressional scrutiny and oversight. Existing laws restricting security assistance and arms transfer to countries engaged in a consistent pattern of human rights abuses should be fully enforced. Demilitarizing or desecuritizing its foreign policy in the region, it may be far-fetched, but it is in the US interest to pursue a foreign policy that upholds the human rights obligations and builds on the mutually reinforcing nature of national security and the human right. Thank you, and look forward to discussion.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Before we begin the question and answer session, I just want to remind you to send in your questions using those Q&A cards. And also, if you're joining us by Zoom or YouTube, to email events@arabcenterdc.org or use the Q&A function on Zoom. We have a couple of questions that have come in online. Let's see. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know this might be a good question for Matt. What would objective media coverage of the war in Gaza highlighting human rights violations result in better U.S. policy, or maybe even impact the elections?
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, I do think, at least as I observe, you know, what I'll call, I guess, the democratization of media, or just the fact that we have far more media outlets and far more ways for people to see images and news than we did in the past, has definitely led to a greater awareness of the reality. Our major media, you know, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, for the most part, still, you know, stay in a very conservative frame. But I do, if people want to find it, they can get that information. But I do think, yes, if you had more, you know, major news anchors or figures in some of those big media outlets who were willing to take I call it a more reality-based approach, or at least a somewhat more objective approach. I think that would, you know, and not just to bring the news to people, but actually be willing to push leaders on these questions. Because, you know, I referenced, you know, the appearance by Secretary Blinken, where he was asked the question about the report, and the thing I noticed about that is there was no follow-up. I mean, we need journalists who are equipped with the knowledge to respond when they get that kind of, you know, those kind of shenanigans in response to those questions.
Yeah, it's not just objective journalism, it's journalists who are really willing to do the job.
Who have the information and are willing to put that information to people in power, yes.
Yes. Here is a question that anybody could answer. What's preventing the Harris campaign from calling for an immediate ceasefire? Which is not, I guess, going as far as to call for other things. What is the political calculus of not calling for this, and will it be favorable given that the race between Trump and Harris seems to be getting closer and closer? I don't know who would like to take that.
Well, I think she has called for a ceasefire, you know, and repeatedly sort of parroted the Biden administration language, which is embarrassing that we've been working 10 months for a ceasefire. That they don't see that that's an embarrassing admission. And she has parroted that. She does not have a strong background in foreign policy. This has never been a priority for her, and she seems perfectly content parroting what the Biden administration has said.
Yeah, I don't know if the key word here is immediate ceasefire. What that means after 10 months is up for debate. All right, a question from our audience here. If anybody would like to comment on Rabia Aghbari's detailed Columbia Law Review article, Toward Nakba as a Legal Concept. I don't know if any of you would like to take that on, since we have legal specialists galore here.
Well, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I do know Rabia, and I have discussed his proposal. We actually published, we at Dawn, in our publication Democracy Exile, published the article that was banned from publication from, was it Columbia or Harvard Law Review? I don't even remember. Columbia Law Review, so we did publish the whole thing in full. I think it's certainly a proposal worth considering to designate a crime like the Nakba as a unique crime that needs to be criminalized under international law for some of the reasons that Ken touched on in the gap between something that is mass expulsion versus something that is genocide. I think these kinds of crimes would take at least a decade to make its way into a treaty or a defined law concept. But the problem that we have isn't an absence of laws. The problem we have is that international law is weaker and more meaningless now and today, thanks in very large part to the United States and its undermining of international law for the sole purpose of protecting Israel from accountability. That's the problem. So I don't know that a new law is going to get us much further. We have the most important international courts, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, using the legal mechanisms, and now we have the United States out and out openly trying to decimate the courts.
All right, here's a question for Kenneth Roth. We saw yet another political theater at the UN Security Council yesterday. When it comes to protecting human rights, has the United Nations become a relic instead of a remedy for global crises?
Well, yeah, I'm very careful to treat the term United Nations as if it's, a single entity. I mean, first of all, we have to understand that there, broadly speaking, are two United Nations. There's, the United Nations, which are, certain officials like Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, or Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then there's the United Nations as a conference room where governments convene. Now, we're talking about one of the conference rooms, the most important, but I think we all know that the Security Council is completely stymied by the veto. The US veto blocks action on Israel-Palestine. The Russian veto blocks action on Ukraine. The Chinese veto blocks action on Myanmar. I mean, the Security Council has not been working for quite some time now. And because the veto wielders hold the key to any reform effort, it's not going to get fixed soon. But to go from there to say the UN, therefore needs to be jettisoned, I think is a big mistake. There is already a movement toward using the General Assembly much more regularly. The US actively did this in the case of Ukraine and, pushed through a number of very useful resolutions. We did this with Syria when referral to the International Criminal Court was blocked by the Russian and Chinese vetoes. We got the General Assembly to create basically a special prosecutor for Syria. Now, when governments go to the General Assembly and try to get positive action on Israel, Palestine, the US says, oh, that's non-binding, and that's just the General Assembly. But the General Assembly matters a lot. And of course, the other body that matters a lot is the UN Human Rights Council, where governments fight tooth and nail to avoid condemnation. And there, the Human Rights Council has actually been quite good at documenting and reporting and criticizing what has been going on, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So, I still find the UN, a very useful institution. I think some of the leadership is pretty poor at this stage. Guterres actually is speaking out about, Gaza in a kind of a humanitarian way, and there's not a big gap rhetorically between what Guterres says and what Biden says, because Biden also says all the right things. He says, don't bomb as many civilians, let in the food, have a ceasefire. Those are all the right things to say. He just doesn't back it up with any consequences. And Guterres has many fewer consequences that he can deliver than Biden. Volker Turk tends to be, kind of only say the most pedantic things and not take on anything difficult. So I don't have a lot of faith in him. But I think to say we're going to throw out the UN just because the Security Council is blockaded doesn't, pay adequate attention to the many possibilities that do exist there.
Here's a question that maybe all of you would want to comment on. To those proposing to elect Harris and then pressure her to shift her stances later, why do you think the outcome will differ from the pressure placed on the Biden administration? So perhaps this goes back to the observation or the statement made that there's no daylight between Harris and Biden as far as U.S.-Israel policy. So what would be the reason or the rationale for thinking that we might have more success in pressuring the Harris administration, should she actually win?
I'll start on this, and I think everybody will want to comment. But look at one. There's no guarantee, but two, Biden still looks at Israel in kind of David and Goliath terms. He still sees Israel pre-1967, surrounded by Arab enemies, this tiny little fledgling aspiring democracy, and he hasn't really caught up with the reality of Israel as a regional superpower that is, completely enforcing apartheid, if not, committing genocide throughout Palestine. And so it is, Harris, as Sarah Lee was saying, because she doesn't have that much foreign policy experience and because she's younger, I don't think she's as set in her ways. She has, the only, distance she's imposed between herself and Biden so far is, kind of expressing more sympathy for the Palestinian civilians of Gaza. I think at this stage, it is a bit of a bet on the future. But I think because she isn't as committed to viewing Israel as, right regardless, that we can at least deal with her. As I said, I don't think she's going to do much more than she has done right now, which is, modest rhetorical steps before the election. That's just inconsistent with her entire campaign. But, we know where Trump stands. Trump wouldn't even be repeating the Biden rhetoric of, look out for civilians. He'd basically just say, finish this off, which, in his view means just, bomb more intensively and, get rid of Hamas or get rid of Hezbollah. And if a lot of civilians die, so be it. So there would be zero restraint exerted by Trump on Netanyahu. Harris is a bit of an open book right now, and I think, we have possibilities with her that don't exist with Biden because he is so set in his ways from a different era.
Sure, I'll just speak briefly. Yeah, first of all, I don't agree that there is no daylight between Harris and Trump. I think there's not enough, or yet. I'm sorry, between Harris and Biden, there's not enough. And I don't agree that there's no daylight between Biden and Trump. I think as poorly as I think Biden has handled the last year and even before, it could be way worse. And again, what Ken said about Biden's understanding of Israel, I think that's right. If you've ever seen Joe Biden talk about Israel, you've obviously heard the story about the meeting he had with Golda Meir. He talks about it all the time. And it's like his understanding of Israel seems kind of trapped in amber in this moment. So yeah, I think there is, Harris's views, I don't think quite are fully formed, but just the fact that she is of a generation that was raised with a different understanding of Israel. How much impact will that have given the institutional imperatives around policy? We don't know, but at the very least there is something to work with. And I think that does matter. Now, just to back up and say, one thing I don't often defend the Biden administration's Middle East policy, but I do think there are also tools they have put on the table, particularly the sanctions that they have imposed on violent settlers in the West Bank. I think this is a big deal. I think people should should recognize this. When you understand that not only have they refused to meet with a number of extremist ministers, they are now imposing sanctions on Israelis. This is the first administration to do the B and S parts of BDS. They hate when I say that, but it is true. But the tools that have put on the table with that memo or that executive order are actually pretty enormous. And if you want to know how enormous they are, and you just look at how concerned the settlement movement is about this. I mean, there's a lot to be done here for an administration that was really interested in moving forward. And so again, going back to what I said earlier, I think building a constituency to push them forward on this is part of the work we need to do.
I think that as I spent my talk explaining, I don't really believe that Harris will make any significant change in U.S. policy in the Middle East from the Biden administration for the reasons that I laid out there. And, is it, choosing for bad versus worse? Possibly on the marginal issues that I was discussing. But if our litmus test is ending arms sales to Israel, or conditioning arms transfers or arms gifts to Israel, or halting weapons to Israel, I don't believe that there will be much difference, because the incentive structure is as locked in as it still is. I know it's not popular to say this, but I'm going to put my neck out there and say, from the record we've seen, not just with Biden, but with Obama before him, the decades of Republican and Democratic billions in military support for Israel, the only thing that is going to change the Democratic Party's calculation is to lose an election because of this issue. If there's no cost that is going to be imposed on them, that is going to make them think, well, AIPAC millions is not enough, and we are going to lose elections unless we change our position on Israel, there will be no significant change. Look at all the promises that Biden made, maybe not about Israel, but even on Egypt and Saudi Arabia. As a candidate, he made much bolder promises that he then proceeded to break all his promises and double down on the Abraham Accords policy of normalizing Israel as its central foreign policy priority. And I don't believe that this is about Biden, old, Amber, and so forth, all of which is true, but Brett McGurk ain't that old, and Amos Hochstein ain't that old, and Blinken ain't that old. These are the people who are driving policy on Israel. They are as in lockstep with unconditional support for Israel than openly declared Zionist President Biden. And frankly, I think that Hochstein and Blinken would also readily recognize and announce themselves as Zionists as well.
Well, there's so many questions that cover a gamut, but I want to try to keep focused on the issue of the upcoming U.S. elections and domestic as well as foreign policy. So here's a question for anybody that they want to answer, can answer. What lessons can we learn from the manner in which the tides turned against students protesting Israel's actions and selecting divestment sometime in the spring of 2024? We noticed a shift from more empathy with protesters to a severe crackdown. Can anyone opine on how this happened and what measures can be taken to recalibrate? And the questioner notes that the Washington Post reported today that New York City Mayor Adams, now indicted, about his conversations with wealthy corporate leaders. That maybe had something to do with his changing narrative and crackdown on the protesters last April.
You have to call on someone, I'm sure, who's going to want to comment on that.
I mean, in that it's dealing with domestic policy.
Well, I can start.
Okay, start.
It is a complicated thing. I mean, I think, first of all, we have to recognize that there were mistakes that some of the students made. I think, whoever the student was who broke into Hamilton Hall and banged through a window with a hammer, it was a completely stupid thing. It completely changed the narrative because, of course, the pro-Israel crowd showed that video over and over again. And suddenly, it went from a peaceful protest for the people of Gaza into a violent protest, and so, things like that, or when, when there were acts of anti-Semitism or acts of, violence that were not policed by the demonstrators and, clearly distanced themselves from that, that created problems. But, most of these protests were completely peaceful. And the university leadership, has been abysmal. I think that, one step they're taking, which is good, is I think universities are moving away from opining on the world and recognizing that their top priority should be defending academic freedom. That's a positive step if they actually defend academic freedom. I think one huge problem that almost all the universities have is these rules against encampments, which I think is just silly. An encampment is just a kind of a more permanent protest. And to do this for the safety of the students or for public health reasons is just silly. It's easy to have a time, place, and manner restriction that nonetheless permit encampments for an important issue like Gaza. So I think there really has been a lack of leadership from universities. Of course, they are worried about donor pressure, and I would love to see somebody, particularly some of these super rich universities, which could afford to do this, to say, if you are a donor, your first priority to a university should be to uphold academic freedom. I'm not going to take money from somebody who wants to undermine the core principle of my institution just because they have particular views on Israel-Palestine. Nobody has done that, but I'm waiting for that sort of leadership. Final point just on the divestment issue. I think the students or the protesters would benefit from a more focused understanding of divestment, because you can actually now cite, the World Court, the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, for the duty not to invest or have commercial relations with anything that supports the occupation. Now that's, different from all of Israel. It's more focused, but if you win that, which is actually what the law should be right now since that decision, that's a big step. So I think, getting a bit more refined about what the demands are could also be useful.
I think our time is up, so I'll just be quickly to say that this is unfortunately something we didn't focus on and we should have focused on, but I see the attacks against student protesters, and not just student protesters, but activists, and not just activists, but NGOs that are critical of Israel, a very naked effort of the pro-Israel community to strip our civil liberties, tear up our Constitution, completely emaciate our First Amendment rights with, as you know, dozens of anti-BDS laws. Now, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to preclude criticism of Israel as a racist state, and so on and so forth, will burn down our civil liberties if it means protecting Israel from criticism. So I am deeply disappointed that the civil rights community in the United States has not been vocal in expressing outrage on this. I am not surprised that the pro-Israel billionaire cabal has now managed to persuade 2 city mayors to deploy city police forces to invade our college campuses to silence student protesters. I think that's shocking. And if, as I keep telling people, hoping they'll wake up, if you think they're going to stop by silencing pro-Palestine speech, you've got another surprise coming very, very soon.
Okay, thank you everybody for your thoughtful remarks and presentations.